everybody. It is time for another episode of The Nostalgia Trap. I am your host, David Parsons. I hope you're excited. I'm excited. My guest today is Eileen Jones, who writes about movies for Jacobin magazine. So we'll get to her in a second. I'm really excited to bring you this conversation. We don't get to talk about movies all that much on Nostalgia Trap. I wish we did. I think this is our first official film critic guest. But movies have been kind of an instrumental part of my whole worldview. Obviously, they are important for everybody. But, I studied movies. I did a film studies degree at UC Santa Barbara, and then film was always a part of my doctoral work. And I teach film currently. So movies are a big part of how I think and how I illustrate my ideas and think through history, etc. And movies are just in a really terrible position these days. And I know that's a very curmudgeonly, old guy thing to say. Movies suck. And I think my guest today, Eileen Jones, would agree with me. She wrote a book, after all, called Filmsuck, which is about kind of how Hollywood makes awful films and doesn't get things right and does things. And a lot of that has to do with politics. Eileen Jones writes from a left perspective. You don't get that a lot. You don't get a lot of film critics who are writing from a literally socialist or left-wing perspective. So her take on film is great. And, I partially wanted to talk about movies because we've got this question of what role does film play in the Trump era? And, you've got Fahrenheit 11/9. Michael Moore's got a new film out right now. Errol Morris has a new film out right now, both of which have gotten pretty bad reviews. I can't speak to either one of them. I think Errol Morris's film is about Steve Bannon, and from what I hear, Bannon really actually controls the show and is a more electrifying figure than Morris, who really has no answer for a lot of what Bannon is presenting. So, have we moved on past those kinds of films? I don't know. But we bat those ideas around in this conversation, and I hope you enjoy it. You can find a lot more Nostalgia Trap stuff all over the place. NostalgiaTrap.com is the clearinghouse for all of our episodes. All of it's free on there. But if you want more stuff, bonus episodes, and if you want to support the show, which we desperately need, neither one of us, and I say us, I mean me and Peter Sabatino, who produces the show, neither one of us have a lot of time or money. So the Nostalgia Trap is really a passion project. So if you want to support our passion project, please do that. And that's at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. And you can get access to bonus episodes and other stuff if you subscribe. And I thank you, and we thank you for supporting the show. It really means a lot to us. Okay, let's get to this discussion of movies and politics. I hope you enjoy it. This is me talking with film critic and film writer and professor at Berkeley, Eileen Jones. I think you are our first film critic on the show, so congratulations, first of all.
Oh, what an honor! Oh my God!
But do you is that an identity? Do you think of yourself as a film critic?
I actually always cringe at the term, because even though, of course, it's what I have aspired to be for a while. I'm enjoying doing this stuff. But it's really a kind of snooty term for a lot of people that I've tended to hate over the years. I mean, a big impulse for me to start writing about film, writing reviews, writing film criticism, is that I hated so much of what I read and really resented the successful careers I saw, because there's no better gig in the world than to be a person who makes living as a film critic.
Right. And it seems like having read a lot of your work, you tend to cringe at kind of pretentiousness at all. So that makes sense, because the film critic seems to be I don't know, historically that's what it's been.
You very much so, and it's kind of waxed and waned how snooty you can be, how much of a complete snob. I mean, we really don't have some of the biggest snobs in the history of film criticism, like John Simon, who claimed you had to know at least 5 languages because you needed to see all films in there and be able to understand the actual language from all around the world. I mean, crazy standards like that.
Wow, that sucks for the rest of us.
Oh, yeah, exactly. He was trying to rule out anyone else being a legitimate film critic except himself, basically. But even now, I guess recently, A.O. Scott wrote a kind of in defense of being a snob as a film critic, because he's trying to say, well, as populist as we try to be about writing film criticism — he's the New York Times critic.
Right.
We have to admit we're here to uphold standards, etc. But of course, without really defining what he means by standards, which are almost always kind of, I don't know, reactionary high culture standards.
Well, it's the New York Times.
Yeah, exactly. It is the New York Times. He's got to.
Well, I mean, I've always enjoyed film criticism, regardless of the snobbery of it. In part, just because I love film and I've like learned from so much of it. And sometimes you find some really good ones. But do you feel like that like, I don't know, film criticism is kind of an art of its own, and it has its own kind of, I don't know, its own kind of language. But do you feel like it's a dying art? Do you feel like there aren't a lot of like major film critics like there used to be? Are we past the golden age of that?
Well, there's certainly many fewer gigs. I mean, that are steady. As the newspaper business dies, every major newspaper, sometimes cities that were big enough, had two, and morning and evening editions, and they all had to have a film critic.
That's right.
There was just so many more ways you could be a film critic. When I was first starting out, and I had a little internship at the Buffalo News, and I was so excited because that's, of course, what I was hoping to be even then. And it still looked so possible. I mean, as long as newspapers were thriving. And of course, now that's all gone away, and it's just gotten to be any kind of intellectual property. The pressure to make it free, because the information wants to be free, gets greater and greater, and more people blog, and more people write reviews, and it just seems fewer and fewer people follow favorite film critics like they would have in, say, the 60s and 70s. That was probably the big glory day, at least in America, for the film critic, when people like, Pauline Kael and Stanley Kaufman and many others, had huge followings. Even people who weren't thinking they were going to watch the movie would read their columns just to stay culturally current.
Yeah.
We don't have anything like that now.
Well, is it also part of like kind of the diffuse nature of our culture now? There's so many different, there's so many different avenues to find content. It feels like there's more content than ever before. So there's not like that one like prestige film that's coming out every Friday, but maybe that's wrong. I think that we do have like nothing but comic book movies coming out. So it tends to direct the attention.
That's absolutely right. We've just seen the kind of, the diffusion is a great term for the different types of content people are watching in all different modes. There's far less reliance on exactly what does Pauline Kael say is the must-see masterpiece of the week or whatever in 1972. That just doesn't have nearly the impact. I'm always surprised. Periodically, I teach like a little section on film criticism, and I'm always amazed if any student, and occasionally you'll find one, actually has favorite film critics and is really following them. But for most people, whatever the tomato meter says in Rotten Tomatoes, that's about as far as they're going to go. They just want to know what percentage says, fantastic or fresh.
And that's incredible, right? It's like to reduce something that's such a qualitative kind of art, to just a number. It actually seems kind of perfect for our like data-driven times that you would want to know like what percentage is this movie worth?
Exactly. Yeah. Let's just get it in terms of Nate Silver.
Oh God.
Data reads. Yeah. Exactly. So,
actually, Silence of the Lambs only rates a 2.4. Yeah. Come on.
The fury over Armand White once again ruining a perfect 100% score as he did for Get Out.
God.
Only negative review for Get Out. So yeah.
That guy seems like a professional troll, right?
Yes, as far as I can tell. He's based his whole career on the most ridiculously contrarian positions, And that was for National Review, so his opportunities for trolling have just gone through the roof.
That's amazing. Do you ever get accused of that? I mean, and it's partially because for people who haven't read your reviews, and I recommend that anyone who hasn't go to Jacobin and read all your reviews and check out your book Filmsuck. All of it's really great. But like, do you ever get accused of being a hater, someone who just hates everything? Because I feel like that comes up a lot in your work, and I've been accused of that too, like the curmudgeon thing. Is that something that people throw at you?
Oh, absolutely. It is my reputation at this point, and I find that really distressing. I do, because it just seems like really, because when I love things, I love them all out, and I really think it's much riskier to say you love something, because everyone enjoys the hating on things. Everyone usually, unless it's like Toy Story 3, and then you really pay for hating it.
That's true. Yeah, but hating on particularly beloved media properties seems to bring out, for people that love that stuff, some of the most vitriolic feeling.
My God.
Yeah. I mean, they're defending something that means something means a lot to them, I guess.
Right. Oh, the biggest response I ever got was something called that was titled, it wasn't my title, Against Meryl Streep.
Oh, yeah, I saw that piece.
Oh my God! People track down my email addresses to send me hate mail. I've just never had any. I've never had anything like it. Turns out Meryl Streep is the third rail. Do not touch her.
That makes sense. I mean, was that after she made that like awful speech at where, the Emmys or something?
Yes, exactly. And I was asked by editor at Jacobin to write something in response to that, and I've found her appalling for years, and I realize that makes me a little unique because she's considered the greatest American actor, perhaps by an awful lot of people, and she's just always appalled me on class terms and the way she presents herself. She has a kind of what seems to me a very upper class WASP presentation that brings out all the all the snob up and down the scale and all the kind of knee-jerk reverence that I just can't stand. So, oh my God, though, people were just slavering with rage.
I can imagine. Yeah, she's an untouchable figure. I mean, I just had the misfortune to watch The Post on an airplane recently, and that movie is so horrible in so many. I mean, I'll reserve that for another show, but like her performance in particular, that makes me think exactly what you were just saying of like she plays Katharine Graham, and it seems like a perfect role for her because it's like this completely out of touch rich person.
Yeah, that's her all over. I mean, she's the queen of the Hillaryites.
Yeah.
Oh, there's all this stuff that should make pretty much so many people that we tend to know if we're on the left hate her, and yet they all love her too. Or many of them. So I just outraged people all over the place.
I think she actually played Hillary kind of in Primary Colors, right?
She did. That's right.
A perfect role for her.
Really fitting, exactly.
That you can't fuck with people's the stuff that people love. I recently, like I don't know, like a year ago, I was at someone's house with a bunch of guys, like liberal people, and I kind of very, admittedly very boorishly said loudly that Stranger Things is for stupid people, and. When I said that, the guy next to me, like, literally grabbed my shoe and ripped it off my foot and threw the shoe across the room. And it kind of, like, stopped the party. And he was like, he apologized. And he was like, I don't know what happened. I just got so mad at what you said about Stranger Things. And I'm like, there you go, right?
Because, I mean, at least the take on it, it's the ultimate 80s nostalgia trip. For me, it was the ultimate 90s nostalgia trip because I love Winona Ryder. So it was
That's right.
Yeah, absolutely. You never over her if you were young when she was young.
I guess that's true. I mean, the 90s are a big nostalgia trap for sure. Like for me, in terms of movies, that's where I was. I was going to college at UC Santa Barbara in the film studies department. During this kind of like indie revolution that happened, that people still like. I don't know. People, I think, look back now. I don't know if you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it's like people seem to look to the 90s as the last like big flash of like innovation and art in cinema. Is that the time that you were getting into film in the 90s too, or where were you at that moment?
Oh, well, I started awfully young, so it was way before that for me. I was way back when I was 10, 12 years old, I became hopelessly obsessed for life. But the 90s were a big era of, just for me, I was just constantly going to movies, constantly, and it did have an almost fatal impact. I'm still fighting like the irony damage of that era.
What do you mean? What do you mean by that?
Oh, it was a kind of stance that was taken. It's usually classified under postmodernism, kind of logic of late capitalism stuff. Mm-hmm. A lot of this kind of so-called blank irony, where it's not necessarily even attached to anything in any way that's represents a critique of anything. It's just free-floating in the air as a position everyone now takes, an ironic distance toward almost anything you could name. And Winona Ryder stood there representing it from the time she was a teenager into her 20s. She was the perfect figure of a kind of wry, amused, distanced, I can't fully invest in anything kind of stance, which was a disastrous stance in so many ways, obviously.
The teenager that's just rolling her eyes at everything, and I think of when you're talking about Winona Ryder, I know what you're talking about. And I feel like it's like Christina Ricci kind of played that role for a little bit in film in the 90s too, right?
She did, absolutely. She inherited. She even co-starred in a movie with her, Mermaids.
Oh, that's Cher. Right. Wow, with Cher.
But But yeah, she inherited the Winona Ryder thing for a while, yeah.
So,
and now I don't know, who would it be? The closest would be, I don't know, maybe Emma Stone, sort of, but not really.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. I mean, that ironic stance never really went away, but it seems like it was at its maximum in the culture in the 90s.
It was. To the point of getting that great Simpsons joke, are you being ironic? I don't even know anymore, man. Because you've just gone into layers upon layers of irony. You don't know where you are in space and time anymore. It was very bad. It was very apolitical. It had all kinds of problems. Frederick Jameson was basically right about it. It is bad. Yeah. Bad stance. Bad stance, at least in broad strokes.
Well, so you say, you got into movies in 10 or 12, somewhere in there, and I mean, I feel like, movies are a part of all of us. I mean, it's mass entertainment, right? I mean, everyone gets this stuff, but some of us get like kind of obsessed. What was it that, were there particular films, or did you go to movies a lot with your parents, or what was it about movies at a young age that captured you?
No, I was that generation of, and this was, 70s when I'm really young, of sitting at home watching $1 Million Movie and Movie for a Sunday Afternoon. Sort of like me and the Coen brothers, and there's a whole sort of string of filmmakers who will periodically cop to that. Of like, that's where I got my movie education. It's a terrible way to get a movie education in some ways, because of course they were chopped to hell for huge commercial breaks. Often they just edited the films to fit. So there'd be huge chunks missing, and only later when you watch the whole film would you ever come to understand what that film had actually been about. But there was also plus sides. It broke down that kind of high culture prejudice, because you'd see all kinds of different films, and they'd just be run in a row. You were just watching, it was just gushing up out of commercial television. So you'd see, I don't know, a Jerry Lewis movie next to some, I don't know, they'd run some crazy high-toned film right next to it, or then, there'd be Looney Tunes cartoons, there'd be just everything seemed to be all cut together. And the Coen brothers have specifically cited it as, this was our movie education, and I had exactly that education. Why it became so addictive, I'm not sure. Is it growing up in a winter culture, Western New York, Rust Belt? You're stuck at home for, months and months and months. Blizzards are raging outside, and you start to become dependent. It was a very TV-oriented generation, obviously. But for me, it was just tremendously exciting. If you were in an unhappy working-class family, with tremendous amounts of pressure, that's, for me, a big part of it. I think the escape into movies was fantastic. And I also, it's weird to say this, because this isn't usually how people look at movies, I felt a kind of working class solidarity with movies and movie making that I've always felt. It was like, no, these things, so many of these old films were kind of made by workers for workers, and it was that effect that I kind of loved. I love old crazy Hollywood films that were clearly made under a lot of pressure, ground out, and made for enthusiastic working class audiences all over the world, and that kind of sensibility I really came to love. This really got in my way a lot when later on I got involved in the independent film world. And, that's where a lot of, art films and high culture values really flourish. And I was constantly stuck at film festivals.
Stuck at film festivals.
Oh, my God. I mean, it's, of course, great in many ways, because you'll also see great things. But, of course, the propensity is all toward film as art stuff, which can be every bit as deadly and formulaic as, any superhero film.
Sure. I mean, it sounds like a lot of the films that you were watching at this point in your life that you're talking about, like the Coen brothers are watching too, are films that most of the culture is not going to consider art. Is that right?
Oh, absolutely right. Yes. So you're sitting there watching what would be condemned as lowbrow or middlebrow stuff and saying, but I'll never forget the brilliance of this moment in this, I don't know, this Judy Garland musical, this crazy W.C. Fields comedy has the most transcendently brilliant chase scene I've ever seen. It seems like it's literally going to vault itself into the stratosphere of boundary breaking. So you're seeing things that generally got dismissed as it's just stupid entertainment. It was made in a kind of factory system of production. It's in the ultimate capitalist system. It can't be all that meaningful. But to me, it just gripped.
Right, because this isn't like, I mean, it seems like most of what we look for in terms of high culture meaning is usually seen through the, like, I don't know, the lens of like the auteur, that there has to be like a name that we know that's directing it. And it sounds like the films that you're watching in the 70s aren't those kinds of movies. Yeah, no, that certainly wasn't what I tended to be drawn to. I was always a genre film fan from the time I was a kid. That was really where my heart was. Not that you didn't see great auteur films as well, and I'd pay attention to those as well, but my favorite thing of all types would be some auteur who's dedicated him or herself, almost always himself in the old days, to making genre films. So, Vincent Minnelli musicals or melodramas are particularly wonderful because you get this crossover point of qualities of, you can start tracing the kind of neurotic mania that infests most Vincent Minnelli films through a series of what is supposed to be formula films and informing them. So I love the tension of that. That was among my favorite things. But genre films in general have always been my favorite, yeah. What, are there particular genres that stick out to you as your favorites? Well, if you looked at overall, the whole lifespan, probably my favorites were, film noir, melodrama, action. Yeah. Including like Hong Kong action. There was a great era in the 80s and 90s of tension between the American versus the Hong Kong action film. It's tremendously exciting to go see that kind of war of the genres play out. That's right. Is that the 80s at the height of the late 80s and early 90s, the height of the Hong Kong action film thing? All before Hong Kong gets handed back over to China. That's right. Crushes the industry. There's just this glut of brilliant action coming out that represents a huge challenge to the American model. And of course, typical American film industry response, they just go buy up all the major talent and say, here's a suitcase full of money, come to Hollywood. And that's how they help decimate the Hong Kong, action film industry. God, and then John Woo comes to Hollywood. That's right. And John Woo comes to Hollywood, and he never makes a film that is anywhere even close. And I knew someone who was his unit publicist, and he was very unhappy with the system. He was used to having total autonomy, having crews who were willing to, kill themselves, almost literally. God, yeah. Same regulations over here, made that impossible. Yeah, he really was a very unhappy man for a number of years. Yeah. Fucking liberals and their regulations, I swear. Oh, they're stupid safety regulations. We're trying to make a Hong Kong action film. Everyone's on wires here, It's got to look good. That stuff kind of like peaked at the Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon thing. They're like, I don't know if they still make those like high wire movies. It seems like everything's CGI now. Exactly. I think that also didn't help. Now that there's a kind of CGI principle, and a lot of the major, if you're talking Hong Kong, they've become kind of a cottage industry of the Chinese film industry, and of course that just billions of dollars being poured into these huge, colossal government-approved spectacles and all that stuff, which is a whole different thing. It just seems like the excitement really died out of it. I mean, I think you still can see an occasional one, but it's not like the glory days. That's right. I mean, that's true of a lot of things. That's part of what I call this show Nostalgia Trap, is partly because of, the feeling that like, things used to be better, but it feels like in the film industry, like films are really bad now. Do you think there was a better time for film? I do, but it's just based on my own personal taste. Right. I'm getting actually worried. In fact, I feel like I need to go back, start trying to find ways to get back to film festivals, because I keep thinking somewhere in the world there are nations that are making really exciting films, and somehow I don't have time to pay enough attention. I don't have time to see them. You don't know 5 languages. And I don't know 5 languages. That's tough. Yeah, so certainly to me it seems like the level of just creative invention and brilliance in genre films, I'm not seeing it. But if you talk to young people, oh my God, they're these wild enthusiasts. They love the stuff that's out there. My students, like, they when I tell them that this is like a dark age of cinema, they look at me like, "What are you talking about?" They love like, the world that's been handed to them, I guess. Yeah, you're instantly, boy, are you old, because you just don't get it. Which I guess is a healthy
impulse in many ways. I felt the same way.
Yeah.
When I was coming up, I felt exactly the same way. Like, you just don't get it, man.
Well, yeah. And if I'm honest and I go back to the stuff that I like really loved when I was 20, a lot of it really sucks. And I thought it was cool because I was 20.
Well, no, that's exactly right. Sometimes you're quite afraid to go back and see what you actually bought at the time. Like, Jesus, that's lame.
There's I love your thing on genre films. I was thinking about that. There's a film that I just saw recently. I think it's called like Rumble on Cell Block 49 or something like that. It's a Vince Vaughn like prison film. And it's
really?
it's totally a 70s film. I mean, a 70s genre film. It's just like really trashy and really violent, and it's not trying to like bludgeon you over the head with any point about like prisons or anything. It's just brutal, and I think you would enjoy it.
God, thanks for the recommendation. I've got to try that. Yeah, I'm constantly asking and hunting and saying there's got to be stuff that where the meaning is not in some overlay or some allegory or something heavy-handed, but it's kind of almost emerging from the kinetic qualities of the film. And that's where you get into some really exciting and surreal and off-the-wall effects that used to just pour out of Hollywood filmmaking when they were making hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of films a year, especially under incredible time pressure, and half of them are on amphetamines of some sort. Easily. They're half out of their gorge while they're making just crazy number of films very, very fast. Of course, you're still going to get piles of junk. You're always going to get piles of junk. But you could also get just incredible, sensational, imaginative, high-impact stuff that doesn't have this horrible, overthought taint that goes on. Genre films will save you from your stupid ideas.
I love that idea of the meaning coming from like the kinetic energy of the film rather than kind of being told. I mean, it's basically like the idea of like showing and not telling, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, my students I'm teaching a class on resistance, so we're watching a lot of like films with like left-wing messages, and they're awful. Like there's so many like awful films that with messages about like social justice and stuff that seem like they could be done in a way that actually like, I don't know, honored the unique power of cinema rather than like acting like they're a magazine article.
No, that's exactly it. There's so many magazine article films, and they tend to win all the awards, which is why there's you can build whole careers on them. And if you're in the academy, that's what everybody loves to teach and watch. The symptomatic film. Look at how this film reflects, blah, blah, blah. And often the film is intentionally reflecting.
Right. Right.
Those very things that are easy to point out. Whole cottage industries in the academy seem to be built on that kind of film analysis that drives me nuts. I've actually had people say to me, gosh, that's great that you really know how to analyze the formal effects of film. I've had that said to me in a film studies program. It's just wild.
Well, let's talk about the Academy, because it's funny you have, we're talking about, and I think I have the same approach to you as like kind of like honoring and like, I don't know, respecting the kind of working class roots of cinema and seeing it as a mass entertainment and not as like, rich Hollywood people talking down to us type of prestige films. Yeah. But how does that square with like, going to the Academy? Because I did the same thing. I went and got a PhD, and yet I have this kind of like strong identification with the working class, and I've found that can be a kind of create contradictions within your kind of ideas about cinema. How is it to like kind of get into the Academy and witness all this high culture stuff coming from the background and ideas you have about cinema?
God, that is such a good and loaded question. It's both a horror show from the word go. If you're a class person in the Academy and you have what you think are anyway working class sensibilities, you're immediately a misfit. You immediately feel like you're having to translate everything you say into kind of more high culture terms. It's just, that is the world of the Academy. It's people whose parents are at least in the high kind of level professional class, if not coming from actual wealth. They summer in Europe. There's all that kind of stuff that goes on as just a routine thing in the Academy. And yeah, so you're just immediately shocked into what am I thinking? But then on the other hand,
yes.
I'm desperate to get out of the really hard scrabble working class myself. I mean, for me anyway, between all my gouts of schooling, I always went out and got a job in hopes that I could just avoid. I hated school from kindergarten. So that's what's really weird, that I've been in this world so long. But I'd keep going out and I'd get all sorts of jobs. I was a waitress. I did office work as a receptionist, horrible jobs like that. I worked at a consignment shop. I sewed little velvet bags for a new age woman who had novelty crystal balls that she was going to put in them.
That sounds like an indie film right there.
I know. I had all sorts of awful little jobs, hoping they wouldn't be so bad that I could, just work for a living and be okay. And they were, of course, horrifying.
Yeah.
Too in their own ways. And so you bounce back into, wow, wait, now I could actually study something that fascinates me and write about it and think about it, and that's great, right? And then you get back in and you miss the working world again. It seems to be a problem that's hard to beat. The old academy promised this would be a safe haven from being ground up in the meat grinder of, probably lower class life. So my family was incredibly bookish, for working class types, and we all flooded into the world of the university. But most of my cousins from my extended family, military, getting the regular job at the phone company or whatever, that's much more the norm. But it was really that. How do I get out?
Yeah.
How do I get out?
And then once you escape into the academy, you realize that that's a world you don't fit in either. And it's a tricky thing. This has come up on the show a lot, especially with working class people who become academics, is that, you're kind of like stuck between worlds because you don't really fit in with the working class people anymore. And you don't really fit in with the academy people. Is that something that you've struggled with in your life?
Oh, constantly.
Yeah.
Constantly. And, what I really find hugely regrettable about my life, here we're getting confessional, is I just couldn't take class rage and move it toward the political. And I kind of, when I arrived in grad school, Marxism was just out. Class was out. It had dropped out of the kind of race, class, gender, sexuality Olympics. That was the one that didn't matter, that no one talked about anymore. It was considered passé. So, when I came in, what was taking the field in film studies was psychoanalytic and feminist film theory. Which was just not a comfortable fit for me at all. I really suffered in those years. And again, I tended to, just by knee-jerk reaction, to bring up class issues at a time when no one found that remotely interesting or wanted to talk about it, and I would just be looked at like I had two heads. So that was a struggle. If I hadn't found Carol Clover, who happened to have written a book that crossed over in its success called Men, Women, and Chainsaws, the first academic study of the slasher film, I don't know that I ever would have gotten the PhD. I mean, there was going to be no one I could work with. So I just got saved by a hair as far as, being in the academy that way. It was tremendously uncomfortable. It's always been tremendously uncomfortable, and a certain act of putting on a mask and trying to fake your way through for me. I've been incredibly lucky considering.
Yeah. It's funny that you bring up the slasher film, because when I think of, and I understand what you're saying, this is where you kind of discover like the study of genre. But it seems like I remember a lot of discourse on slasher films is like exactly that feminist psychoanalysis stuff you're talking about, right?
It is, but it was kind of still bringing in genre through a back door.
Yeah, right.
Gave me just enough cover to be able to still do kind of what I wanted to. But you're right, you still had to talk it constantly in terms of gender. I even had fights in seminars saying, how come we suddenly all have to cite chapter and verse what Lacan said about Freud and all this nonsense? There's 20 different ways you can study this genre. It would sometimes be we're studying a genre like melodrama in terms of feminine, and I'd just be told there is no other way. I was told straight out, horror film works in terms of psychoanalytic, film theory. That is what it is. There is no other way to look at it. And I would just be like, you're all crazy. This is like being in some sort of religious camp. I can't handle it.
What's the other way of looking at it? Because I think what you're saying generally, I think the argument I've heard the most about like slasher films is that they like recreate, they recreate like patriarchal violence and stuff like that, and it's like all about that. But I agree with you. There are other ways of like analyzing these films. But how do you see those films?
Good question. I mean, I'm more interested in I think.
Yeah, there you go. Yep.
I'm more interested in looking at genre as genre, which means it's developing over time in ways that are. I'm interested in kind of historical placement often. I'm interested in the ways that the elements function together. It's not that you can't get great readings of the slasher film There's a couple of genres where, in fact, psychoanalytic and feminist film theory brought out really great interpretations. Melodrama, I'd say, the work of Alfred Hitchcock, and probably horror film and slasher film.
Sure.
You got great stuff out of that. But there are other disturbances in the psyche beyond just, say, gender-oriented and psychoanalytic. I can remember being in a seminar that my friend John Dolan was also in. For example, we were watching Alien. And he said, well, how come we can't look at Alien in terms of evolutionary horror? Because we see the evolution of the alien from a little kind of crab-like facehugger to bigger and more monstrous forms that look like an evolving creature. Why can't that be something about the Darwinian horrors of evolution? And again, the look at someone as if like, wow, you're crazy. You just don't get it, man.
That's so weird. That's because that's so like anti-postmodern to say that like there's just one interpretation and it's correct.
Oh, it was a crazy time. Literally, even doing a historical reading of industrial practices, or just again how it's developed over time. That was considered like we don't do that anymore. We've got the answer. It was a very strange time of like master narratives that would take over, and if you wanted to have a career at all, you had to jettison anything else you were doing and say, I am now doing, feminist and psychoanalytic theory. That was the only game in town for a while. It was a very cool system.
Where did your kind of, I mean, I guess this is a way of like talking about politics, but where did your kind of class analysis of film come from? Why were you, I mean, it sounds like you're developing basically a left-wing kind of, or a leftist like critique of cinema, but also a leftist kind of critique of the film studies discipline at the time you're in it. Where does that stuff come from? Where did you kind of develop that politics?
I mean, where was I kind of placed in the world? Because again, it took me ages to even get consciously political, which again, I'm totally ashamed of. It's unforgivable. All I can claim is it was a time especially the 80s was just a ghastly time of feeling fatalistic and forever defeated if you were on the left. It just seemed like the whole culture was moving seemingly permanently in exactly the opposite direction. I mean, for me, I just have almost the most basic kind of class fury that comes out of my own family experience. That we're placed we happen to be in the Rust Belt, I'm sure you know.
Yep.
Whole communities built on, steel, automobile manufacturing, etc. That all moves away, and now you've just got a ton of impoverished communities. In Western New York, where there was so much poverty, we just happened to land as a family, just through a fluke, in what was considered a very affluent town. We wound up with a suspiciously affordable house in this affluent town. So everyone around us, immediately around us, was wealthier than us. And I don't know of a better way to convert people or make people aware of class and of their own anger at what a crazy system has resulted in this. So there was just that set of attitudes. Then I wound up going to school in Buffalo at SUNY Buffalo as an undergraduate. There it was a little more comfortable because everyone I knew was very, very working class. Everyone had jobs to help pay as they went through, school. Everyone worked every summer. It was all work. We all worked like mad. We all had beater cards if we had cards at all. It was that kind of thing. Everyone bought their clothes at Goodwill.
Yeah.
And then I came out to California after I graduated, and you could just smell the money in the air. I'd never encountered wealth at that concentration in my life. I was in the Bay Area, and all of a sudden I knew a ton of wealthy people, and I just never really had. I mean, we had neighbors, but we were very isolated when I was growing up. We didn't really mix with the affluent families, and now suddenly I had friends who it turned out had trust funds and had fabulous vacations, and when they wanted a house, their parents said, here's the down payment.
I hate them. I hate them all.
So like stealthy, so you didn't know. They hid out amongst you. Yeah, right. Yeah. And so that also just was a process of constant sharpening of a kind of, this is just outrageous. How can this go on? And when you, of course, you deal with rich people, you immediately deal with these, often, not always, some of them actually have their consciousnesses raised as well, but for most of them, a kind of blank incomprehension at you. Like they don't understand what you're talking about. Or I can remember being with a friend who pointed out a cherry picker, and said, who drives one of those? I mean, who does that for a living? And my husband said, I actually did that. When I grew up, she was also wearing glasses, and she was so mortified. But it was just her assumption. Everybody who's anybody, of course, has left all that laboring stuff behind. Nobody does that anymore. The invisibility of, the working class.
But yet, these are the people that also like to pay like lip service to the kind of like downtrodden when they can, and like there's it's a weird kind of relationship. I feel like. I don't know. There was a person in a history department, a professor a long time ago that in the department, I'm an adjunct, he's a full-timer, so there was already that kind of class thing going on. But I mentioned that I was going to Las Vegas to visit my brother where my brother lives, and he said, like, oh, who would ever live in Las Vegas? I can't even imagine ever going there, let alone living there. And it was just kind of like, well, first of all, like, fuck you. But also just like the idea of like he couldn't imagine even being in this city that in his head is a place filled with like, I don't know, what would be low culture, I guess. Right,
exactly. And so you're constantly either confronted with, do I confront everybody about when they're doing these, quite justifiable anti-military rants, but the same kind of who would ever possibly join the military. When your father was a 20-year Navy man, your cousins are in the Marines or whatever, and it's like, well, I'll tell you who. Working class people. That's who. That's who. So because it started as a career. That's
of course. I mean, I'm in my family too, and you imagine that like you had mentioned that this idea that your kind of like working class rage, your class rage didn't really translate into politics for a long time. At what point does it? How does that happen for you?
Distressingly late in life. It's the kind of thing where I'm in grad school and starting to go to a rare or occasional protest, but it's that kind of limp, kind of liberal showing up. I was not involved in anything. I didn't even know kind of how to begin. It so seemed like that, what we now call neoliberalism is absolutely the only game in town. I just wasn't focused on it. It really was an unforgivable thing, especially to be at, UC Berkeley, where, at least it has something of a proud history, even if people don't realize the extent to which the university did not really participate in any way willingly in, the anti-Vietnam, the student taking over faculty buildings, all that stuff.
Oh, no, they sought the National Guard on them. I mean, they destroyed those people. I mean, I imagine you've seen the documentary Berkeley in the 60s. Have you seen that?
No, I still haven't.
Yeah, okay, you should see it. It tells. I've watched it like 3,000 times because I show it in my classes all the time because it shows like so much great footage. But yeah, the administration, literally put the National Guard on their students, and when Ronald Reagan came in, it was even worse. I mean, sheriff's deputies came in with shotguns.
Exactly. So even though there's tributes now, like there's the Free Speech Cafe.
That's amazing.
That. That's that, and of course, literally we're targeted periodically by neo-fascist groups because they think that's where, radical left-wing, political activism is, and it's just a lie. And now it's literally not there at all. But there would be these very rote, demonstrations. There'd be, grad student, GSIs, graduate student instructors would strike. There'd be that kind of thing. And
labor stuff, academic labor stuff. But you're saying that the students at Berkeley aren't as aren't burning down the ROTC and all that anymore?
Sadly, I'm not even seeing the rotes. Used to be very regular. At least every spring there were strikes. Even if they were small and not that effectual, but now I don't even see that.
That's amazing. That's a big change.
It's a big change, and I think it's because we were still living a little bit off the fat of the land. There was still a little more access in the system. You still had more confidence that if you came out with a Berkeley degree, you could do pretty well. these are students who are running scared, quite rightly so. There is no fat in the system for most people now, and most of them are working. They're working like crazy to get themselves through a much more expensive program than it was even when I was there. The tuition has just steadily been going sky high as we get more and more expensive administrators living, in incredible mansions. We have ever more layers of administration paid like off the chart salaries. So the whole thing that's happening at Berkeley is, dreadful and embarrassing.
Yeah, that's awful. I mean, on the one hand, I always thought of Berkeley, like every time I went up there a lot in the 90s and late 90s, and there was just tons of activism going on. It was like that was like the battle in Seattle stuff and against globalization and IMF and all those kinds of things. I mean, it was at Berkeley that I first recognized when I was young, when I went up there, I first realized about like how big a problem police brutality in prisons were, because there was like a big demonstration about that up there. But it sounds like, yeah, that's awful if Berkeley is a place where the students are no longer feeling that way, in part because they're like you said, running scared. They're stuck in a system that's ripping them off.
Right, and it's not like there's none, but it's just not nearly the kind of high profile attention getting. So in fact, what we got the most high profile stuff was combating, Milo repeatedly showing up.
Oh Jesus.
To give speeches and stuff, so that would get people.
Well, even Milo going is a symptom of that kind of like idea of like a Berkeley as the stereotype, of a certain kind of, that's where all the radicals are, when it's not necessarily exactly like that anymore.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's still, I should have been doing more, and I wasn't doing more. I was really asleep at the wheel as far as that kind of thing. And it's really been in the last, I don't know, several years when I really started writing more, and of course got invited to write for Jacobin, etc. And then I started just saying, I've just got to get much more strongly involved. So I first, was sort of attending ISO events, International Socialist Organization events, trying to see if that was going to be a fit. For various reasons, not quite right. Wound up joining DSA, as so many people did. I think it was January 2016. And then, of course, again, like so many people, Trump gets elected, and the next day, myself and, 70 others show up at the East Bay DSA office, very much startling the 10 senior citizens who were almost the total membership. It was very tiny.
Wow.
You couldn't believe their eyes. They look out and they're like, what? We don't even have chairs enough for this. What? And that was the beginning for many, many people. Distressingly, ridiculously late on my part.
Well, I mean, we talk about the Berkeley campus, and one of the things that I try to correct on this show is this perception that the college campuses are always the place where things are happening. But I mean, you live near. I feel like Oakland is a place in the last few years that Oakland has been a site of major left organization. Is that something that you've seen? And it sounds like the DSA is something that's still growing there.
Oh my God, yes.
Yeah.
I think we're well over 1,000 by now, and growing by leaps and bounds, just like DSA itself is over 50,000. And of course there's been tremendous amounts of Oakland activism. We need to be doing a lot more to connect with our organization, with the activists who are preceding us. And of course films are emerging out of this activism, which is also very exciting. And just this past summer, basically, we're actually seeing things percolate up into cinema, like most best known Boots Riley's Sorry to Bother You.
Sure, yeah.
So all of a sudden, Oakland as a site of filmmaking and political activism on the hard left is suddenly a thing. It is very, I hate to have such low expectations, but it's hard not to when you're an American. It is, I think, can't deny, it's really thrilling to have socialism be something you can bring up, and people now kind of have heard of it in a way that's not anti-commie hysteria that, infused the culture for forever.
Yeah, and it seems like that stuff isn't sticking anymore, to just say like socialist and expect that people are going to have all these negative connotations about Russians or something like that. Although the Democrats might bring that back.
Oh, they're trying, and I don't think it's any coincidence. This kind of, trumped up, good way to put it.
Right.
Russia hysteria with its little echoes of, the McCarthy era, anti-commie witch hunts. You can't help but think it's not a coincidence that it's happening.
They're putting up a wall about socialism. Yeah, I hadn't thought of it quite that way. That's really scary.
Oh no, it's terrifying. I went out to dinner with some people, and they were all 100%. No, the Russians are infiltrating. They're taking over our institutions. They're poisoning.
Jesus Christ.
Bodily fluids. I got into a huge, little tiff argument with somebody over this that went a little beyond the bounds of politeness. I just couldn't believe my ears, but everyone was in agreement. I was the only one saying, this is crazy. This is 1950s rhetoric. Are you really buying this? And they were buying it 150%. It was crazy.
Yeah, I think they'll continue to buy it. I think that's their kind of way of dealing with Trump, is to just kind of aim all that they can at him, to deflect from the failure that created him and the failure that they're a big part of.
Exactly. No, it was very easy to identify where they were politically.
Don't get me started on those motherfucking Democrats.
You will just curtail that.
Yeah. So the other problem, we got. So I wanted to ask you about, because I am teaching this class about, like, I don't know, activism and film, which I think when you put those two words together, I do cringe. Like, this is like my activist film. Those tend to be pretty awful, and no one wants to watch them. And like, I wonder if that can be or if that can be fixed, because I'm thinking about, I don't know if you watched Boardwalk Empire, but there was a socialist character on that show. And he put on socialist plays, and they were super boring, and like everyone walked out, and they were like, he was just an awful artist. Yeah. But it seems like Boots Riley is someone who has like good politics and is a good filmmaker and good artist. Why is that so rare? Why do so many activist films suck?
I think it goes back. I think it's a whole process of suckage that goes back generations. It's that high-minded, didactic style of filmmaking that just infuses so much of what we see that we associate with, kind of liberal left politics. Anytime you go to can you hear the train?
I love that train. Yeah, that's awesome.
I'm always right on the tracks.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. It
sounds like the Great Depression outside your window. Like that's like an old steam train just went by.
I literally could throw a rock onto those damn tracks.
That's amazing.
I was raised this way. Proudly. Anyway. Yeah, if you go to see, high-minded documentaries at your local art house theater, you're standing amongst what you can plainly recognize as, it's the liberal left. And going to see the film is practically activist for them. And you're going to recognize all the kind of typical tropes of this type of cinema. But then that's why it was so incredibly refreshing to read, like, interviews with Boots Riley. And he's just like, I don't want to make a message picture. Because nobody wants to see it. So I got to find a way to slam across something that's refreshingly funny and harsh and wild and, a crazy special effect people are going to be talking about. He's really got the right idea. And the film is, you've seen it, of course. It's messy. It's kind of all over the place. It leaps around in tonalities. It's all of these things. It's not polished, I think, quite deliberately.
Yeah. I mean, to me, this is the stupid point, but it's kind of like, we need to learn that filmmakers need to learn a lesson from like Rage Against the Machine. Like, take your leftism and package it in something that the masses like rap rock. If you know the point I'm making, though, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, this is an obsession with mine, because if you actually know enough people, like through your family or where you were raised or whatever your circumstances is, that you realize these are the people who aren't going to be reached by groups like East Bay DSA. It's like, how do we even begin to make any inroads in the great mass of people who work for a living, who are fundamentally downtrodden, who in some cases, in generations, haven't ever participated in a strike, haven't ever really fundamentally rebelled, aren't even really conscious of this is systemic. How do you reach them without preaching? Because they're not going to listen to preaching, right?
Do you think they listen to Michael Moore films?
What about the Michael Moore films?
Do you think they listen to them? I mean, he's been a popular figure for a while. That's kind of like who I'm thinking of as like kind of like the preaching kind of filmmaker in some ways. I know it's an open question. I often wonder if films like that reach people at all, and reach the kind of people that you're talking about, that like are completely unaware of how things are systemic and how they can change it.
Right. I mean, when he made his first film, Roger and Me, I had very high hopes. I was a very big fan of that film.
Me too. I love that film.
Loved that film. I thought, this guy is smart. He's effective. He knows how to reach a mass audience. He's working class. He's practically wearing a costume of the working class.
Yes.
He's personalized it all. I grew up in Flint, Michigan. My family worked for General Motors. I'm trying to, force Roger Smith to be called, the CEO, to be called to account. All of that stuff seemed like a series of just really inspired moves that we hadn't seen. But it seemed like, and there's other films that I like, but over time he's had less and less effect. Yeah. And his politics have been revealed to be more and more kind of sketchy, shaky. Where are you exactly politically? Sometimes you seem really hard left. Sometimes you seem like a classic liberal. I don't know what to do with you. So I think he's gotten much less effective over time, especially because he's repeated a lot of what made Roger and Me very powerful. He's repeated the certain effects with less and less payoff for a lot of people. I
agree. And he seems like a filmmaker that isn't really engaged in what you're talking about, which is kind of like using the art of cinema to in innovative ways to get these messages across. It seems like the same shtick. Exactly. And yeah, I agree. It doesn't really work anymore. It feels like, this isn't like some everyman that's bursting into these like halls of power here. This is a guy that everybody knows.
Every time he tries to get into the office of a CEO now, it's just like, come on.
Yeah.
You're Fillmore. You could but of course they know you're coming. We've seen this a million times. It's just getting to the point where, and his attempts to send out his, various screeds to encourage people to be activists. They've just gotten kind of rote to the point that I don't think he's getting a lot of attention. He's got a new film coming out.
That's right. Yeah.
I can't remember the name of it, but I know it's coming out.
It's called Fahrenheit 11/9.
Oh, that's right.
Which I think was an awful title.
That's the worst title I've ever heard.
Yeah. All right. So we know that you hate everything, but I don't think you hate everything. You like the Coen brothers, right?
I am the world's biggest fan, I think, of the Coen brothers.
Yes. When did that start? Were you an early fan of Coen brothers? And I guess I know we don't have a lot of time, but why do you like the Coen brothers so much?
Because the Coen brothers seem to have absorbed the kind of combination of formal craft, like they're fantastically great technically.
Yeah.
Editing, shooting, all of that stuff is just primo, both inventive and just kind of gorgeous. And they combine it with this kind of wild and humorous and exciting and inventive storytelling style that seems to me is a very deliberate throwback to their beloved, Hollywood films and their beloved Pulp Fiction. They're huge fans of Dashiell Hammett, Raymond Chandler, James M. Cain. Those are some of their great inspirations. So they are into the kind of 19th century. 20th century pop glories.
Yeah.
Their culture and trying to find a way to kind of revive them and make them fresh, which I think they have, and to make them meaningful. Plus, they're among the most astute observers of the American experience making films now. They're the only people who are interested, as far as I can, or almost the only people in the country who are top filmmakers who are interested in failure in America and what it means not to be able to make it in what's fundamentally a cruel system.
Yeah.
They're consistently looking at what it's like to stumble and trip around and be desperate and be scavenging for money in often criminal ways. It's all so often about just the dire process of trying to get a foothold in this culture that is so punishing.
Jerry Lundegaard comes to mind as you're describing this character that William H. Macy played in Fargo. As I saw that movie at a very young age, and that character his desperation while smiling at the same time is something that to me is kind of an unforgettable character in the sense of I know people like that. And it seems like there's a desperation that they capture that's pervasive in our culture.
That's exactly right. That horrible expression on his face, that rictus smile of eating and fawning. Who hasn't worn it? Who's had to work in America? We're all doing it all the time if we're not ruling class, because that's part of it. That's part of being able to be allowed to survive. And we're just seeing more and more dramatic, examples of maybe we're not going to be allowed to survive. Maybe we're just to be servile enough.
Maybe we don't deserve to survive.
That seems to be part of the thinking that we're seeing more and more nakedly. It's really been appalling yet interesting to see the gloves come off.
Right, right, and it feels like when you talk about the Coen brothers, their filmography, I don't know, it kind of goes. It makes sense to me after talking to you for an hour about your kind of your sensibility and what you like about cinema and what you don't like about cinema, because they're both like working at that high level of craft, but at the same time they're kind of they're talking about really dark stuff about America.
Yes, and they're using American genre films,
right,
elements in combination, and that's great because the genres are genres that survive because they're fundamentally intertwined with the cultural experience. A genre will die as soon as it no longer has any relevance for a culture. So they just use that fact. It's already meaningful. It's already going to have an impact, and brilliantly recombine it to show us a very dark, satirical view of the way we're living.
Yeah, Serious Man is, I think, one of their best films.
I adore that film. It's one of their greatest. I wish it were better known. It's such a brilliant film about just the incredible estrangement and madness and, again, desperate, insane situations. This poor professor or would-be professor.
Yes.
To get tenure, and of course, if you're an academic, your heart is just like pounding in your chest, like, yep.
Oh God, and how they marry those kind of like I don't know. There's just like quotidian disasters of his life to the larger questions of like God and existence is just so funny and dark and scary. I find that film, if they had to pick one film that's like a statement of the Coen brothers, that film felt very personal to them. It felt like it was really autobiographical in some ways because it took place in suburban Minnesota with suburban Jews in the 60s. It seems like that was them.
It's the very closest they have ever come. Normally, you can't get them to say a peep about personal lives. They hate the American press because the American press is always trying to get them to tell about their personal experiences, who they really are, who they're married to,
Right.
Just don't want to divulge. So this is the one film where, more directly than any others, it's like, yep, this is basically a version of how we grew up as, secular Jews in America in the 50s and 60s.
Getting stoned during the bar mitzvah.
Yeah, exactly.
All that. Yeah, that's incredible. And I like what you said about genre, and I think it fits with the Coen brothers so well. It's like the genres, these, I think about the Western as one that like came and went, and it had its moment where in Hollywood they were making like, every 10 films, 8 of them are Westerns or something like that. And it's like there's a reason behind that, and it felt, I know that you could go on and kind of analyzing that, but what I wanted to say was that genre seems like the way you're framing it is that genre is like a good like container, like a container through which like artists can like navigate the terms of their art through these packages that are pre-made and we're already like kind of ready to respond to,
and that are already culturally intensely relevant. Functional, So the Western's a little tricky because it's considered passé, but they found ways to revive it and revive the way we've still got a kind of ideological investment in these forms. And, the Western, frankly, morphed over into the action film and sci-fi and other places.
That's right, yeah.
Still got those tendencies, and they find, again, very dark ways to evoke in things like No Country for Old Men. Many of their films have Western elements to remind us this is our ideological history, and it hasn't gone away.
So great. Eileen, I love your writing. I really appreciate you talking to me.
Oh, it's been such a pleasure. Thank you, David.
Okay, I hope you enjoyed that conversation. I want to thank my guest, Eileen Jones. That was a really fun time. I hope to bring her back again. I want to talk more about the Coen brothers. I want to talk more about the direction of American film in particular and how genre films can be our weapon against totalitarianism, fascism, and even capitalism itself. So thanks a lot for listening to the show. Please check out the Patreon, patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. Subscribe to the show. We've got bonus episodes coming very soon, so make sure you subscribe and you can get access to all that stuff. Okay, thanks very much, and we will see you again. Take care. Bye-bye.